Welcome to Boarding Pause. We want to help you launch your commission. Whether you're preparing for a mission or considering moving overseas for the gospel, join us as we explore essential steps to help you pause before you board the plane, equipping you spiritually, practically, and emotionally for your mission overseas. Whether you're fundraising, preparing your heart, or learning how to share the gospel, we've got you covered with expert guests and real-life stories. With humility in mind, your host is asking these same questions and learning with you. So let's listen to this week's episode of Boarding Pause. Hey guys, welcome back to Boarding Pause. I'm your host, Genesee, and today we have a guest with us, and her name is Kristin.
Hello, hi, hey.
Kristin was in Taiwan for 8 months, and she's going to talk about her experience and how preparing for that kind of went for her, and just, all the things that come with that. So you started a coffee shop there, or you helped start one, or what was that kind of?
Yeah, they had already started the coffee shop like 12 years before I got there. So they're, I think, one of the oldest the oldest Envision sites. So there's so many different countries that have Envision sites. So it started like internship programs. So a lot of them will do like English education, or so like specifically in Indonesia, or I don't know if there's one in Thailand. I think they're going to start one in Thailand, but Indonesia was specifically doing English, and so is Taiwan. And they were using the coffee shop as a place to reach people, and then as a kind of a education center as well. So it was half coffee shop, half education center, but all under the umbrella of the Envision site. But it was a full-on business. Like, it wasn't just like, we're using this like as like a nonprofit. Like, they did raise a lot of money for it, but they had like Taiwanese locals working at the coffee shop, and I wasn't allowed to even work there because they only allow locals to work for profit, for money at their businesses. So it was a full-on real deal coffee shop business. So what I did there was I helped with the English education, and then I also helped the coffee shop. I did a little bit of like training. So I actually learned how to make drinks and started learning about how I can open up my own coffee shop, specifically with actually, I would say that there was like mention, like talking about values, because the Envision site had specific values for the coffee shop. And so we even talked about like opening a coffee shop with specific values, like starting there. And then I helped with their activities. So I actually ran a campaign for like an art night, and then a health night, and then helped with their sound fest, which was like a music night. So that was the main things I did there. I did a bunch of other things sprinkled in, like we did homeless ministry, and we did like outreach to some colleges, which and then I was involved in like their bazaar, which is like their business. So we did like meetings and a retreat and stuff like that, and just learned a lot about how to like run a business, which it was all new to me, incredibly new. So it was a good base start, I would say, especially if I want to do something with like the marketplace. That was very heavily what it was, like doing missions in the marketplace.
Oh.
Yeah.
So they really just threw you in there.
Oh, they really did. It was like the first week we did the English. I like led a table. The very first week I had like just touchdown Tuesday, Friday I was leading a table, and then Saturday I was learning Chinese. So they really did. They push you at the deep end. They really do. So hopefully you know how to swim.
That's good.
Yeah.
So before you went on this 8-month trip, what are some things that you had to do to like prepare yourself rather than just like packing your suitcase
and go and just hopping on the next flight? Yeah. Yep. Yes. And this is something that I think you'll ask this question later, but this is definitely something that I wish I'd even done more, because no matter how many times I took perspectives or went to cross conference or all these places, and people are just like, you need to prepare, like it's going to be hard. I was like, yeah, it's going to be hard. And then that's all I thought about it. And to me, it was just like, I think it was a piece of like the great adventure. And I was just like, it's going to be hard, but it's mostly going to be good. So I would say that what really helped me was 9-month group, which is even more intensive than the disciple making intensive. And it's like a apprenticeship, a discipleship, intensive discipleship group about preparing to either be a long-time goer overseas or a long-time mobilizer here in America, or even mobilizer overseas, who knows. And I think, that was like my main preparedness piece. So I did that through City Light, and also just did some training through Envision, which is really interesting because Envision's trainings were pretty quick. And so we had one weekend where we just like had a crash course in like cross-cultural missions, and then I maybe had some like online things that I had to answer. But other than that, and a book that I didn't read. Other than that, I would say my main training was through the 9-month goer group, and I realized that was actually very, very valuable because not having a church to be connected to or like a community to be connected to before leaving was probably the biggest, or would have been the biggest downfall for me had I gone overseas. And so honestly, the community piece and the education piece were huge. And I think that's where like this, I don't say this, hopefully this doesn't come off as an insult to Envision or the Christian Missionary Alliance, but I felt like that was like lacking for me personally in what they provided. It was very much like do it on your own, which I think is, they had people checking in on me and stuff like that. So it wasn't like I was like, you weren't pushed off in the deep end right away, but like if somebody wasn't connected to church, it would be very hard, I think. So I would say that like just being involved in church through City Group and the Goer Group was huge for me.
Do you feel like the Lord is using you right now in what ministry you're doing right here in Lincoln?
If I said God's using me this way and I was like the other person listening to me, I'd be like, she's not even using the 3 circles. Like she's not even like not a professional Christian at all. How does she even on the mission field? And so I just think, but like Taiwan was the catalyst for that. Like Taiwan was the great disrupt. Like God used Taiwan to disrupt me. Like God is the great disruptor, and he used Taiwan to just like wreck me in every way possible. And so now, what is ministry? I don't freaking know. Like to be so real. And it's even like this idea of like what I learned in Taiwan is like, it's crazy. This is crazy. But like being a missionary is not fixing people. And like, that was what I was so heavy. Like my mind was heavy on that, like fixing people and for the sake of the gospel, for like all these people are sick and lost. And like, no, like you're returning an image bearer back to their full, like back to the image that created them, the person that was the image, like it's like matching the star into the star hole, the star block into the star hole. And that's just what I was missing. And I didn't realize that until I came back to America and was like trying to get back into ministry immediately. And so like, this is another thing that I'm like, for people who are going to missions, like be prepared to just like everything that you knew be disrupted, and God's going to use you in the midst of that. And so like, yeah. And I would say Taiwan, like God told me, I think I'm like 99% sure God told me that like I was in Taiwan and I was like, what's next? And he was like, this is just a time of preparation.
And living on mission and following the Great Commission doesn't always look like getting on a plane and going to the 1040 window.
Yeah.
Like there's several people holding the rope, as we call it. And part of that can be just literally being in community where you're at and mobilizing people to teach them about like the fact that there really are other people that don't believe in Jesus and the gospel.
Yeah.
In short.
Yeah.
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 If everybody was in the 1040 window, who would continue to mobilize the Christians that are in the reached places?
Yeah, that's good. There's different ways that we fit different. Like I can't be a foot if I'm a hand. And that's what, yeah, I think that's what you're saying.
That's a good analogy.
Yeah, I'm full of them. So
what are some encouragements for like, people are like, oh, like now if I go, like what if I'm going to be like all burned out, or maybe I'm not like a professional Christian. Like, what do I do now?
Yes. Oh gosh. I wish I could like record my life leading up to Taiwan and then in Taiwan and then just show people and be like, just don't do this. Just like, don't follow my example. And okay, I'm being very critical of myself, I think too. Like there's a lot of ways that like, I think just like I trusted the Lord, and I like look back on this, I'm like, how did I do this? But I just like trusted the Lord in the way that he provided funds. And so I think like prayer and trusting the Lord, like having total faith that you're like walking the path that he's set before you, because otherwise the doors would close. I just think about Jonah, like every single like doors just kept closing for him. I mean, he was running away, and like and then God like led him back to Nineveh, and so it just like I just fully feel like, okay, if even Jonah in his full rebellion like was being blocked by God, like me and my like surrenderance of my time and my money and my resources, like how much more like would God like gently lead me away, or like gently shut a door, or like fling one open. And he flung open Taiwan. And so I think like that can prevent burnout. It's just like trusting the Lord and knowing his character, and knowing, I think too, of just like being fully convinced on how he's like saved you. Because, and then walking in that authority. And I think too, like the surrenderance of like, I want my life to glorify the Lord. I don't want to glorify myself, because there were so many ways that I wanted to be seen during this process, and like how, like I felt like I had to do everything then. The things that I wanted to do to be seen flowed out of that desire. One thing that I'm very proud of myself, and this goes for the non-burnout, is to say no. When you're in the moment, like I had to say no to a couple different things. Like I stepped down from homeless ministry, and I said no to going to outreach at the colleges, because I was just like, this is not what's in my giftings, and also like not in what I want to learn. And my leader was really understanding and supportive, and so that really helped me. And also like preserving energy for relationships. Like I think it's easy to like, it was easy for me to spread myself thin and not be considerate of like the people that I should and could invest in. And actually the two interns that I met that came like later on, but were they going to be there for a year, they did a really good job of this, where they like really focused their energy on very specific people and leaned into their giftings and spent time at home cooking meals and inviting people into their home, and also like finding places that like filled them up. So there was like a coffee shop near their house that they would go to that was owned by missionaries, and they would go there and just like sit there for hours and talk with their kids and talk with the owners. And like, so finding things like that, like really like I said with Sabbath, like prioritizing those things, prioritizing no, and prioritizing prayer, believe it or not.
There it is.
There it is.
I was thinking one thing when you were saying that you're not going overseas to fix people.
Mm-hmm.
You were also talking about, like, you mentioned, like, your relationship with Jesus and how you felt like you really weren't following the Lord in Taiwan as much as you were here, like, before. And anyway,
yeah,
with the fixing part, going overseas and like following the command of the Great Commission, if you don't have a super close relationship with Jesus, I feel like, would you say that like going overseas would not fix your relationship with Jesus? It can definitely grow, but
yes. Oh, that's such a good question.
For the new believer.
Right. No, it will not. Because I thought that doing more would make my relationship with God stronger. Like, I thought it would mean that I'm a good Christian and I'm doing what God has told me. And no. I think you have to have a very, like, especially if you're a new believer, like, I don't think there's anything wrong with, like if you're like, I do believe God's calling me overseas, like going on a short-term mission trip. And I'm not here to prescribe one way for anyone, but like that preparedness, man, that like even 8 months, like being, just so like being prepared, and not just knowledge, but your relationship with the Lord, like checking in, like seeing what the check engine light says about your relationship with the Lord. And like, obviously you're not going to reach, there's no like, you've reached finally the whatever prescription of whatever type of relationship, but yeah, it's not going to fix it. There were a lot of ways that God brought me to new surrenderance, and like even going was like surrenderance. And like one of my friends really reminded me of that, of like, that surrenderance is beautiful because like you went without like many hesitations. Like I really wasn't like, oh, I'm giving up a lot. Like I was just kind of like, yep. And so, and so there was a lot of ways. Yeah. Like you said, like it does grow, but it's not the cure. That's for sure. It's like the equivalent of like when we were in high school, or when I was in high school and I thought, oh man, my relationship with God is really rusty these days. I can't wait for like a lock-in or like a high school retreat. Then it'll really bring it back to what it once was, like those emotional highs. Like that's not what a short-term mission trip is like at all. So yeah.
So if you're a new believer and you've been in the spiritual high, you've been going to conferences, hearing more and more about the missions and what God's heart is for the nations, just the Great Commission in general. And you're like, I want to do that because now I'm really close to the Lord. I'm going to do these things and I'm just not going to fall off of this high. Don't get drawn in by just that high and like how you feel, but also the prayer.
Yeah.
Is very, very important.
Yes. I highly recommend this book called Spirit Walk to anyone who, Genesee has already read it too. I'm currently in it and I'm on the chapter, I've just passed the chapter where it's like wait on God in prayer. And it's like, you can't do, like, just really bringing home the fact that like everything is out of abiding in the Lord. Like you will do things out of something, and whatever fruit it is, it will be the result, like nature versus nurture. I mean, whatever you're nurturing, whatever part of your spirit you're nurturing in whatever way, like it's going to show.
I was talking about the spiritual high.
Yes.
And like not going because you're on a spiritual high, or just like even like don't go just because you have this idea that like this is going to be really cool and like I'm going to help so many people.
Yeah.
Going in with like too many expectations.
Yeah.
And I mean, even in my own like prayer and thought process of going overseas just this summer for like 6-7 weeks, I realized that I hadn't really thought about the people and I hadn't been involved or like really know a lot of international students or people from like all over the world. I'm just pretty much friends with like my American Christians.
Yeah.
And I kind of fell in love with the idea of going to the 1040 window and fulfilling the Great Commission, but hadn't really built any relationships with people from those areas.
Yeah. That's a really cool revelation. That was something similar. It was just like, but how do you get there without it being like, now this is a new project? That's something that I was like, I need to pray that I'm actually friends. Like, I'm not, like if I'm, okay, so 9-month group, we met a bunch of Afghan refugees. And I was like praying, I was like, I need to actually be friends with the Afghan refugees. I'm not just going, because we all know the situation with Afghanistan is that, and then the refugees coming here, of like, I'm just not just going to them because they're like a charity case. Like there is a need there, but like there's also a need for community, and like out of community are those needs being met? So like, how do you become friends? And this is me. I'm not saying that you were thinking this, but this is like, these are things I had to consider because my mindset was so like, yeah, I got to fix people for the sake of the gospel. And it's like, no, like God doesn't look at people and see just like he sees depravity, but first and foremost, he sees an image bearer of like somebody who like to reconcile with himself, and just like, that's what I want to do. I don't want to look at somebody and think, okay, they need God because they're just so broken and lost, and like, I can do that. I'm going to fix them. It's like, no, how can you, get to that healthy perspective? I'm not saying that that's where you're at, but that was like my thinking process of like, before I went, where I can be at with that. Yeah. What do you like? Do you have an answer to your pondering of like?
I think with just like my own discipleship, where I'm at right now, I'm a Bible study leader with my college ministry, SALT. And with that, I've just seen like a lot of fruit, and just like the Lord using me through that to, literally just have relationships and friendships with these people. Like you just go, you like go work out with them, or you go to the park, you just take a walk, just getting dinner with them. Like all of that is just community. Yeah. And you're just investing in people that like everybody wants to be seen. Yeah. You mentioned that too. Like we all want to be seen. And so it's the same thing if you're going overseas. It's just a different culture. And even they're like, they're still human. Of course. Yeah. Like, So it's really like the question of like, how do we love people how Jesus loves them, and how do we see people how Jesus sees them? Because he loves everyone, even if they're not following him, like Jesus ate with sinners. Yeah. So how can we sit at the table with these people that don't know him and just invite them in without them feeling like a charity case or a project?
Yeah. Because it was, you hit the nail on the head with that one. I've been thinking a lot about that lately, of like, even like making this like distinction in my mind, at least, where I was like, I'm going to like I'm sitting with people in their hopelessness, and like, man, every human has hopelessness, and it's not even that it's just unbelievers' hopelessness. Like, I mean, we have a different type of hope, but we still struggle with hopelessness as like believers. And so it's just like, it's not just about like, oh, I'm inviting this, for example, this tax collector into my home. Like, it's just like, I'm just inviting another human into my home that happens to do this thing, but I also happen to do this thing over here. And so it's like, we're, like not othering, like as a Christian, not othering somebody else just because they don't believe in God or have like a very specific sin that like personally I don't struggle with, because I do struggle with this other sin. So like, how do you, I think, like not even being able to put it into words of just like what I've been processing through, and like realizing even when I was in Taiwan of like, we would sometimes do prayer walks at the temples, and would walk in there and just like almost like pity the people that were worshiping there. And that was when I realized that I was like, I think I'm demonizing this religion and like pitying these people, and like that's based off of my perspective of like I have something they don't, but like in a sense of like pride and like in the sense of like, now I need to fix them. And that's not at all like, I don't think any healthy perspective would ever have or think about. So yeah, I love this conversation of like, how do you go overseas in like a cultural context and it not being like this, I have this that you don't have, when there's already like these things existing within the country that people do have like faith in God. Like Taiwan is a pretty rich country as far as like there's churches here and there. And if you say you're a Christian, nobody's going to like then bang down your door later in that night and arrest you. And so, yeah, how do you, especially as an American believer, where I feel like I said, like my perspective was we got to go to, like, it was missions in Africa, like this very like, as I'm bringing something that nobody else has in these different countries, but there's these, I mean, especially in like East Asia, like an underground church like happening, and there's people who are Christians who are praying heartily, and like if we're gonna compare, like I have prayed twice versus like there are 5 times. So me coming in with I could go off on a soapbox. This isn't even on topic, but like just humility, like that's the biggest thing, which I think we both like just inviting people to the table is like
we don't even deserve the gospel.
Yeah.
We don't deserve our own salvation.
Yeah.
So sharing it with other people, you're like, you know, Jesus found me.
Mm-hmm. I didn't find him. He found me.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah. That's good stuff. Missions really brings out like the wanting just like this gnawing of humility at my mind. I'm just like, yeah, we got to talk about this. Yeah. Did you feel anything that was like pushback of like, oh, like maybe I had a different perspective on this, or like maybe I think it's this way, of like the things that I said, and maybe that's like, I don't know. I'm just really curious. I feel like, I mean, my perspective is just one and my experience is just one of like, what are your thoughts? Do you have anything in the moment?
I would say, like, I've heard your story, but I've also heard other people's stories. Yeah. But some of the listeners have probably, like, some of them might not have ever heard a story of someone going overseas. And so, I think from that perspective, there could definitely be pushback. Like, like maybe I shouldn't go to this place yet. Yeah. Or maybe like some of them are saying like not at all. Like maybe I shouldn't go over missions because I'm going to be burned out. Yeah.
Oh yeah. And I don't want, that's a good point. I don't want this conversation to be like, it's all negative, blah, blah, because it's not. Like, I want to say that like everything that I'm telling you, answering these questions is like, this is good. Like, this is all good and like for God's glory of like what I'm learning and how I'm being sanctified. And like, I had an incredible experience in Taiwan, and like the good far outweighed the bad. And like, I would even say like, if not anything, like these 2 girls that I was friends with, like one of them messaged me the other week and was like, hey, I got baptized. Like, and she was somebody that I didn't even know was interested in God. Like we would have conversations, and there was like a lot of emotions, and I just was looking for hope, and would say things like, yeah, it sounds like you have this type of hope, and that's something. And then like my other friend who like had no interest in the gospel, and then I like FaceTimed her like maybe 2 months after I got back from Taiwan, and she's like, yeah, I'm actually reading the Bible a little bit now. And so like, if none of these things, like you just like are going through like the day to day and just like living your life, and just like God's just like speaking through you, and like what in your weaknesses and your strengths, and like, and even my sister who like, she lived in my apartment while I was, and I'm sure God could have done this even if I hadn't gone to Taiwan. But she lived in my apartment when I was gone. And my 2 roommates were part of like the Nation City group. And she ended up going with them, like, I think was going to an entirely different church before she moved into my apartment, and then started going to this Nation City group, and then did DMI and is like on fire and was considering doing a 9-month group. It's like, because she wanted to continue learning more about the nations and surrendering that. And so like, just like the way God orchestrates all these things. And so knowing that I was supposed to go, and like knowing that that's like the joy is like in that suffering, like there was suffering and there was joys. And it's like, man, like I wouldn't have traded any of those moments for anything. And like, I have no regrets on going. And so like the pushback, I would say like, oh, Kristin had nothing but negative experiences, so I probably shouldn't go because that's scary. But like, no, like the Lord met me in so many crazy ways, and it's still continuing here, like this sanctification process, and just like seeing how the Lord is, like he didn't need me, but he chose me to go. And so, yeah, I'm glad you brought that up of just like, man, and like that, you could like even hear that in like perspectives and stuff. Like they just constantly say over and over how hard it is, and like missionaries leaving the field and blah, blah, blah. But it's just like, it's worth it. At the end of the day, it's worth it.
And I think it's important to hear like experiences like yours where it's not always sunshine and rainbows.
Yeah.
And like just hearing these people's testimonies, like I was Muslim and now I'm a Christian, or I like left my family. Like there's all these stories and stuff, but also just the perspective of what you learned about yourself and your own relationship with God. He equips the called. So like we're all called to go, but he doesn't call the equipped. Like nobody will be like 100% ready to go.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah.
And that is like, I feel like that's definitely the truth that I was living in, and the truth I'm living in now. Like I know there's people that I'm like sharing the truth, the gospel with, just in different ways. And it's like, yeah, you're just not, he's equipping you for each season. And that's like, that's the craziest thing about him is like, he allowed me to go even though I was burnt out, and he allowed me to like stay for the 8 months, and he allowed me to like, invited me, like not just allowed me, but he invited me into these things. And he was like, yeah, here we go.
I've heard it said before, like, our question shouldn't be like, should we go? But like, have a desire to go unless we're called to stay.
Yeah.
Would you agree with that statement?
Yes. Because I believe that was like what led me there in the first place, is I wasn't like waiting around for like, oh, maybe I should do this. But I was like, no, I'm going to do this. I should do this. So I'm going to do this. And so I think that was my full on experience. Because I think people were expecting me to be like, I had a friend in Taiwan who was like, yeah, I saw Taiwan in my dreams like 5 different times. And then God, I just sat in front of the map of Taiwan for 8 hours straight and just prayed. And I was like, bro, I just had a meeting over a Zoom and said, yeah, this feels right. And so it's just like, neither of those are better or worse than the others. And so it's just like, just go. The worst that God could do is just close the door and say, not now, or no. Like, that's what happened. Okay, so I have to tell this story. My roommate, she was going to go to Africa. And she was like, I was fully expecting to come back from Taiwan and she was going to be gone. Like, that was the expectation. And then it just, like, shifted. And she had to surrender this to God. And now she's no longer going. But now God is using her in her strength. So she's a nurse and she loves children. And so God is using her to be a doula for people, to advocate for women, and specifically she wants to work with refugees. And I've just seen, like, so even the experience, like even my experience, like the surrendering process, the sanctification process, the like you find out who you are in God's giftings and who God is in the midst of all this, and like, oh, it's so worth it to just say like, okay, I'm just gonna do it and see what happens. Yeah.
I think we could probably change the statement if it's like we should always be on mission to go unless we're called to stay, is yes, have that mindset, but just being open-handed to like what the Lord could do in our lives and how he could use us, just being open-handed to that, he can open so many other opportunities.
Yeah.
Just like your roommate.
Yeah. It's such an incredibly encouraging story, my roommate's story, so I have to share it everywhere.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thanks for sharing that.
Yeah. Thanks for letting me. I feel like this has just been like, you're like just helping me ramble and organize my thoughts. And hopefully it like.
Yeah, I hope this has been helpful for you.
Oh, I hope this was helpful for you too. I hope you're like, oh gosh, now I got to find a new person to talk about. No, I'm just kidding. I'm kidding. I really appreciate this opportunity. So thank you.
Yeah. All right. Yeah. So for the listeners, if you have any questions, you can comment on Instagram, TikTok, YouTube, even under Spotify, just on this podcast. If you have any questions for Kristin, you can comment there. She'll look at them, hopefully.
I'll try my best.
I'll let her know.
Yeah. Keep updated.
Yeah. And to stay up to date with other podcasts and just highlights and reels, follow Boarding Pause on Instagram, TikTok, and Spotify, which is maybe where you're listening, and YouTube.
So well organized. Good job.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Kristin.
Yeah. Thank you, Genesee.
Yeah.
Thank you guys for listening. And it's so cool. I think it's so cool, the journey that you're on right now of just like figuring out what God's heart for the nations truly looks like, and it is, and what it looks like for you.
Yeah.
Just cool to hear your own musings about that.
For sure.
Yeah.
Well, yeah. Thank you guys so much for listening. We'll see you in the next one.